Welcome, Senator Kim, to episode 2 of our weekly Hangouts. I'm so excited to have you here to talk more about this week's topic, which is, how we treat Indigenous folk historically, currently, and then looking into the future. So thanks for being here.
No, thank you for, inviting me, and I'm very pleased to come to you from the shores of the Kitchissippi, otherwise known to many people as the Ottawa River, and I'm on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe.
Well, thanks so much. Can we talk a little bit about this new collective awareness that exists around the historic the historic treatment? I think we're still missing out on the current treatment in terms of collective awareness. But yeah, I guess this historic treatment, what are you seeing and hearing on your end? And yeah.
Well, it's great to see people waking up, is the way that I kind of think of it, and that to our historical reality. Having worked in and around the legal and prison system for about 40 years, it's been painfully obvious to me for many decades, for 4 decades at least, the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples in this country. The first Indigenous, when I started working with young people, I was shocked at how many racialized and in particular Indigenous young people were being criminalized and imprisoned. And our jails are full of people who are poor, people who are trying to negotiate past trauma, and overwhelmingly those who are racialized. And so as we're having this discussion, almost 44% of women serving federal prison sentences of 2 years or more are Indigenous, 10% are Black. So the majority of women in prison are racialized women. If you go to provinces like Saskatchewan, 98% of the young women and girls in custody are Indigenous. And the numbers are high for young men and older men as well, or those who identify as men. But the numbers are most horrific when you look at the intersections of race, gender, economic, lack of economic support and equality, and when you look at past trauma. So, to me, it at some level, it's shocking that people didn't realize this. But I guess, if you're, every time I go into the prisons and someone comes with me, they'll say, "Oh, I can't believe who's in prison." And I'm thinking, well, where did you think we were putting people who we weren't providing supports for? So generations ago, we, when I say we as a country, Canada, started the first prisons for Indigenous people were reserves. So as Canada wanted to make room for railways and settlers, then people were literally pushed off their lands. Indigenous people, First Nations people and Inuit people were pushed off their lands into areas where they wanted people to be. And so, all of our national parks, they're great. It's great from an environmental perspective, but those were Indigenous lands that people were taken out of and moved into other areas, often less hospitable areas. We know that also happened for people coming who were escaping slavery or who were enslaved and once they were freed. And we know that's true for many immigrant and new people who are new to Canada. And so the first jails for Indigenous people were reserves. And if they went off the reserve without the authority of the Indian agent, they could be criminalized, they could lose their support, whatever minimal supports they had. And some of the first women jailed at the Prison for Women in Kingston, which was the first federal penitentiary for women in the country, were actually jailed for not getting medical attention when they had children. Now, why were they jailed for that? Because that's the only crime they could be charged with. But what they were really doing, not many women in those days got medical attention when they had their children. But, and usually you were charged with that if something happened to your kid and you were negligent and didn't go and get help. Well, in these cases, these were women who went and hid in the bush often to protect their children, because we know now that if they had their children and the Indian agent registered their children, then 5 or 6 years later, those kids were taken away to residential schools. So women were being criminalized for trying to protect their children. We know now, fast forward ahead, people are still criminalized for trying to protect their families, their water, their lands. And so we see land protectors, we see water protectors being jailed, we see elders being jailed when they're trying to prevent pipelines going in, those sorts of things. And so over years, we saw generations of people trying to protect their children from being taken away to residential school. We saw those children come back if they went back to communities without the supports, without the knowledge of their culture, of their community, without the skills to parent. They were parenting in the abusive way they had been parented in residential schools. And so then we saw things like the what's often referred to as the 60 scoop, which really is still happening. There are more children, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in child welfare today, in the so-called care, in the control of child welfare today than there were in residential schools in the day. So we saw the generational impact continue, and then we had kids stolen from their families, placed in non-Indigenous, often foster homes, group homes, adopted out. And so we saw generations, again, the multi-generational impact of disconnection from land, disconnection from family and community, and what was often described as killing the spirit of Indigenous peoples. And then we saw, if you were in those situations, in a child welfare situation, it's still really the case, but it was absolutely the case until 1984, when child welfare and juvenile delinquency, as it was referred to, were separated, that young people who were in the care of the state would often be in the same settings as young people who had been criminalized. Now, bearing in mind at that time, the Juvenile Delinquents Act was brought in because there was and ultimately child welfare legislation, because there was no way to protect children at a time when we had more laws to protect property, and when men owned basically men had power and authority over their children, their wives. And so if you were a woman or a child, you were the property of the man who either was your father or who married you. And so we didn't have rights really for children or women in those days. And so it was a group of women actually who tried to develop laws to protect children who were described as vagrant or on the street, or whose mothers were struggling for all kinds of reasons, or who were left, who were single moms and so were deemed to be unfit. And so those young people would be taken into the care of the state. But the initial laws that were used to protect those children were animal cruelty laws, if you can imagine, because they were the only laws to protect against cruel treatment, or laws that existed to protect animals so that men who owned the animals didn't abuse them or mistreat them. And so we have a long, long history of not recognizing many as human, let alone children, Indigenous people, other racialized people, women. And so that history developed. And so I say all of that not to sound really depressing, but to say that it shouldn't be a surprise to us that individuals who are not supported for generations end up disproportionately in the only system that cannot refuse them, in the system that allows us to devalue people still, even though that's not what it's supposed to do. And so that's our criminal legal system. I don't call it a justice system because there's not much just about it. And so we see the trajectory from colonization, residential schools, 60s, or the forced removal of children, the involvement in juvenile, and then into the adult criminal legal system. And so down the road, we end up in a situation now where, decades, generations on, we have a vast overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons. And we don't have the same representation of Indigenous people in educational institutions, in professional situations. And the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that did its work in the 1990s first did a really good documentation of this. But I suspect most young people don't even know about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and what it found. Fast forward ahead, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. More people heard about that, and they did a great job of engaging, in part because what Murray Sinclair and the other commissioners did was go from community to community and have open public hearings, and people came and told their stories. But for many people in this country, that was the first they knew about residential schools. And that's only 6 years ago that report was tabled. And the calls to action go from child welfare, economic insecurity, criminal legal system, family matters, and the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Even then, we still didn't see the calls to action implemented. And I think parenthetically, it's important to say that the commissioners asked for money to dig up the grounds around the residential schools because they knew from all of the stories that people had heard for years that there were children's bodies buried there. Now it's taken this year for that to really be brought home in ways that it was there in the report. It was documented in the stories. And yet now people are just starting to really think about it in a more fulsome way. And then the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. The same issues that give rise to women being the fastest growing prison population are the very same issues that cause Indigenous women to be more likely to be disappeared, murdered, end up on the streets as they are to be in prison. Because we know historically that violence against women and children has not been taken very seriously. Violence against racialized people has not been taken seriously. Violence against gender non-conforming people. The issue goes on that if you don't fit the stereotypic norm of heteronormative male white privilege, that it's in intersecting layers that you don't feel the same support and protection of the law. And so all of that is being broken open in ways that make people uncomfortable. I've had people say to me, you're talking way too much about privilege, white privilege and white supremacy, and you're making us uncomfortable. And I'm thinking we should be uncomfortable. Like, I'm in an incredibly privileged position, no matter what my background is. And lots of folks know that I didn't come from a really privileged background, but I am now in an incredibly privileged position. And part of our responsibility is to make those of us with privilege be uncomfortable. If we're not uncomfortable, we're not paying attention. And that sounds almost trite to say, but young people are making sure we are paying attention. And, the March on the Hill on July 31st to draw attention to the lack of investigation into what happened in the schools, the lack of the release of the records of the young people who we know went missing or were murdered or otherwise died in the schools. That should all be released. And, because of the work I've done with prisons and in, seeing people who are disproportionately dealt with by police, I have a real concern that the people who keep the records, who make the records and keep the records, also have the privilege of creating the narrative. And so the history that you and I learned in school, even worse, the history I learned, was an incredibly racist, white supremacist, privileged history that whitewashed, quite literally, Canada's history to, I still learned that Louis Riel was guilty of treason and was rightly hanged. That is the complete opposite of what the reality of history. But, historically, and going back and, I'm already getting boring. So or you're probably thinking way too late, Kim. But anyway, those who have the power of the pen also have the power to create their own narrative. And increasingly, what I think is incredibly valuable is young people are insisting on having, it's the power of the media, but it used to be the power of the pen. Whoever wrote it down, that was what history was. And it is incredibly skewed in favor of those who are most privileged. And we need to challenge that. And thanks to you and so many others who are doing that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the least we can do is create attention around the role that we all have to play in reconciliation. And I think that's really what our project tries to focus on, is that it's really easy for us to be like, yes, government, please care about Indigenous people and do something about it. But that isn't enough, because we also have a role, and ignoring the role non-Indigenous people have just like protects us from discomfort. That's really the only thing that it does. It doesn't help the situation. It doesn't make things better. But before we sort of talk about steps people can take, can we talk a little bit? Can we talk a little bit about like why, if we know all of this, nothing is changing? Like if we know that there's water that is not safe to drink, and if we know that the foster care system is disproportionately representing like Indigenous and racialized youth, if we know like that the criminal system is messed up and super racist, like, and if we know the Justice Department has records, why aren't we just fixing those things? It feels like when you
Obvious.
know better, you should do better, and we know better. Why don't our lawmakers and elected officials take action there?
Mm-hmm. And sorry, I jumped in there and interrupted you. I apologize for that. You know, we not only do we know better and we should be doing better, we need to be challenging that, you know, why is that? Who benefits from us not doing things differently? Well, it's exactly who you know benefits. It's corporate interests. It's those who have the greatest privilege and power. If suddenly in this city, in Ottawa, there was a boil water advisory, how quickly do you think that would be fixed? Why? Because there's a whole bunch of people who the government cares about and who are going to vote them out, you know, next election if they just leave us with, you know, a whole bunch of undrinkable water, horrendous living conditions. It's because too often the people who we're talking about are not seen as valued, or they are not as visible in terms of here in Ottawa or being their voices being heard. And that's why I think the rising up of young people and insisting on being heard is vitally important, because your voices are being heard and politicians are starting to realize, you know, it's more, you know, in lots of places it's more performative than transformative yet. But, you know, oftentimes when I was learning to be a teacher, one of the things that I learned was that you have to say things. I forget how many times, 29, anyway, I can't remember, it doesn't matter. But you have to say things so many times before you start to really internalize it. And then you have to start to do it to believe it. And I think we're in that stage where it's being said enough that people are starting to realize it. And so now the challenge is for us to continue to push and insist on the changes, not just the performative action, not just the orange shirts, not just, you know, the, you know, I've often talked about, we don't need to indigenize systems, we need to decolonize them. That yes, having, you know, I'm, you know, here I've got artwork from people who've been in prison, and because it's overwhelmingly Indigenous people, guess what? I've got a lot of Indigenous art from that I've purchased from people who have been in prison or are still in prison. But the reality is, it's not just about those symbols. In fact, if that's all we do, we will fail. I mean, the individual who we support may do okay, but we have to insist that we actually decolonize. And that means things like ensuring that we have things like drinkable water, that we have not just $5 or $10 a day childcare in situations where there is no childcare available, but that we do things like provide guaranteed livable income so that people can stay home and take care of children in situations where there isn't a childcare center because it's a small community, or that people want to go out on the land and learn, whether it's hunting, whether it's fishing, whether it's gathering, whether it's, you know, ecotourism, so that they can, you know, their communities can make better living. Whether, you know, it's how do we learn more sustainable approaches to community work and community living, whether it's developing what, you know, one person once called extraordinary communities, where everybody has a part in the community, and you don't value people more than somebody else because they may have don't have the same intellectual or money-making capacity. So in all kinds of ways, I think we can be challenging. And again, I think youth are on the cutting edge of this in terms of getting that information out, ensuring that it's more than just, people making the right sounds, that we actually make the changes, the substantive changes that need to happen. I'm hopeful, we're in the Senate. It's interesting that I would have been amongst the folks who thought, what's the use of our Senate? I shouldn't, probably many of my colleagues would say, why is she even there then? But it was when Trudeau said he wanted a more independent Senate that was going to represent the interests of those who otherwise aren't represented, whose voices don't usually get heard, or whose voices, worse still, are silenced and ignored, that need to be in the Senate, or need to be at least expressed in the Senate. That's part of our responsibility. Unlike an elected politician who's there also trying to get reelected, our job is to represent those interests. And so any of us who aren't doing that, I think you're right to hold us to account and call us out if we're not doing those things. And, that's part of what we need to be doing more of. And the fact that we now have gender parity again in the Senate. It's, I think it's the Yukon or Northwest Territories. Anyway, we're only the second body in the world, apparently, to get to that kind of gender parity, which is atrocious. We certainly don't have we have better racial representation now, but we still don't have, adequate. And forget it when it comes to income disparity. You have to own property to get in Senate. So it's already, and there's a number of us working on, how do we actually make that a more fair process? Because if you're Indigenous and you live on reserve, you can't, unless you buy property somewhere else, you're disqualified from being in the Senate. How ridiculous is that the First Peoples of the country are disqualified in those ways? So those are things that we need to be challenging as well. And we don't talk a lot about them. And, if you don't know, you can't challenge it. But I think it's part of our responsibility to share how these places work, not to pretend it's some secret society that, only the ones that get in here can know how it works. We have to be reaching out. And that's why, I keep thanking you for providing this opportunity for me to engage with you and other young people, because it's vitally important. Otherwise, we remain the stale, male, pale institutions we've always been.
Yeah, one thing that's, you said so much that I feel like we could talk for hours about this, but one thing that I keep thinking about is that with an election coming up, I want to vote with, my top voted issue that I'm voting around is the Truth and Reconciliation 94 calls to action. So that's what is a primary area of importance. And when we asked our community online, what are the top 3 things you care about? Almost we had thousands of people who write in their top 3, and nearly every single one of them, over 80% of them, had Truth and Reconciliation listed in there. Or 94 calls to action, or Indigenous, some variation of that. So when someone calls my house this year asking me to vote, or when I go to an online debate, or if someone comes to my door, how do I make sure that I'm asking the sort of questions to the new, the people vying for this seat of power and influence, that this is a priority for them, and that it's just because the topic is trending, they're going to care about it until it's not. How do I've never really, I'll be honest, in past elections, I haven't been as open to voting for anyone as I am right now. I've always voted for the same party, and then this is the first time where I'm I really don't know for sure who I'm voting for, and that's largely because I am not voting for myself anymore. I'm voting with the idea of the communities that, I believe if we lift them up, we all will do better. So, yeah, I guess, how do we hold them accountable? What should I ask? How should I engage?
Well, I'd be interested in what all your those who are watching and who are tuning in say as well. I'd say a couple of things. I would first, instead of saying, "Are you implementing the TRC? Are you committed to it?" Very few politicians are going to say no to that. But maybe the question of which calls to action have you acted on, and what have you done about them? And which ones are you planning to work on in the future? Two things will happen. If they've never looked at them, they better, excuse my language, but they better darn well go and read them, right? And see. And if there are particular ones that you're interested in. So for instance, I often ask politicians, what have you done around call to action number 30? Well, 30 is about mandatory minimum penalties. And we know that the government said they were doing something on that. They implemented or they introduced a bill C-22. But in fact, when you look at what it was actually going to do, it wasn't going to change much. So they said it was a response to that, but in fact, they didn't really do much. So there are ways that, and in fact, maybe that's one of the things we could do in future discussions, you and I, is talk about some of the particular calls to action and what are the actions that we should be demanding from our elected officials in order to show that, demonstrate that they're working on these things. So that's one way. I know that one of the other things I'm planning to do is, and inspired by young people through some of the information that came in through our TikToks, was people wanting to know what could be being done about poverty and what are some of the facts. And so a number of folks have said, could you put something out every day during the election? So I'm going to try. I'm a techno twit. You guys all, that you set this up, and I just try and dial in, and sometimes I totally screw it up. But what I'm planning to do, because we're going to be in between interns when it's probably the election period, and read all the amazing young people who work with me who make make it look like I know what I'm doing. But we're planning to put out a fact on poverty every day that people can ask the politician, or say, why is it that 3.5 or 5 million Canadians weren't helped during the pandemic? Those sorts of things. And I think there are those sorts of initiatives that you could be doing, that you could share with us, that we could also be highlighting and creating more space for those discussions as well, because I think it is really important that we ask those questions and not just accept the platitudes back of, oh yes, we're really committed to this, and oh sure, our party's going to do it. The other thing is, when you see something, we want to try and get things in the party platforms for sure, because once something's in a party platform, that's what they're getting. If they get elected, that's what they're supposed to act on. And then it's, I think there are ways to, it's not guaranteed, and certainly we've seen lots of things that were in the Liberal Party platform, just to name the party that's in now, that did not get implemented in the last two electoral periods. But it provides a way to actually hold a bar up and say, this is what you said you were going to do. You've fallen way down here. We want to see you move up here. And how are you going to get there? And demand those answers. So we could be looking at, for instance, what the party platforms were last time around. But most importantly, I think, is how do we influence people making commitments now so that we can try and hold them to account as they come in. So I think those are vitally important questions, and good for you for thinking about those and how we're going to. I agree. I think it's going to be what people say they're going to do, and then what they do from here on in is going to matter more and more. It already matters for young people, but I don't think politicians have been paying as much attention to it as they should be.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's because I grew up using Google, but the moment a leader says something that doesn't sit well, or I feel like that can't be right, I Google it, or I check Twitter, or I start a conversation with people. And I think that's the thing, that even if you grew up native to social media and the internet, and always having it at your fingertips, it's like we're fact checking it a lot faster, and then we're asking the questions and having community discussions that even if me and my friends in real life are not engaging in this issue, I have friends on the internet that are. So it's harder to pull one over. I mean, they are pulling stuff over on us that we're not seeing, and such. But with, especially around performative action, I think there's like a bigger call from millennials and Gen Z just being like, that does nothing though. Like, thank you so much for taking, like, Truth and Reconciliation report came out 6 years ago, and finally the oath of citizenship was changed. Like, that's like an easy, low-hanging fruit. Could have done that the first month. Like, why did it take that long? Why did
Absolutely.
and like, why aren't we working substantially on these bigger, giant, systemic issues that when you are just one party in charge, there's opportunity. Like, it's been the same party in leadership. Like, you could really fundamentally switch things in 6 years. Why should I believe that anyone's going to be different this time around if you had 6 years and have done nothing to show me for it? And it's several of the parties that have been in power. Like, it's hard. Like, it's not just seeing what's on their platform, it's looking at their track record and understand, like, maybe for us as everyday folk, we haven't had this collective awareness about certain issues because of the way we were taught about it or because of the way the system is set up, but our leaders have been told about it. There's no way, like, they're paid to do a job that is to know and understand Canada well, and for them to be like, we didn't know about this, and that's, you shouldn't have that seat. It should go to someone else. So I don't know, I feel a lot of frustration around like performative actions and just the idea of like, we're just going to be like we're going to be like, thank you for doing that. I like, it means nothing. There's time for that has come and gone, and now we need action that will make a difference, because the time it takes to enact change, that means there are people suffering. It means there are people struggling, that once you enact the change, it's still going to take time to fix it. So jump on it. So these like 94 calls to action, to me, by now, we should have seen so much more, and we haven't. And that's really alarming.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, like it, and I liken it to like, it's like having a really important test coming up, and you're allowed to bring in a cheat sheet, and it feels like our leaders are, and like the cheat sheet is the 94 calls to action. All the work is done. It's all laid out there. You just have to follow it. And it's like going into that test and not bringing that with you. Doesn't make any sense. But
no, it's true. And it's why the Indigenous women in particular were so upset that the action plan from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry as well was delayed a year because of the pandemic. Hello, the pandemic was declared in March. The action plan was due in June. Nobody believes that, you needed those extra 3 months to finish the action plan. It was an excuse. And so, I agree. And I think the holding it up as almost like a report card, like you have failed on the TRC calls to action and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for justice. Like, those two are two incredible action plans that could be put in place right now. So that's, I think you're on the right, absolutely on the right path, obviously. And so calling out and not just calling out, but, pushing them to make commitments to actually work on these issues. Because I think many, I remember Murray Sinclair saying, even if you don't read the whole report, and it's all available, for folks like me who like to now listen to things when I walk the dog. Rodney is like, I'm listening to something and he's happily trotting along, and it's all online. They had people read the whole report into the record, and so you can listen to it if you don't want to read the volumes and volumes. But even if people just read the calls to action and the summary report, that's really important. And any young people who haven't looked at it yet, I suspect young people have looked at it more than some of my generation, sadly. But we should all be being called to account if we're not working on implementing those calls to action and calls for justice.
Well, let's maybe wrap up this here, but to be continued, because I think there is so much more to be discussed around the Truth and Reconciliation report and what we can do as individuals and what we can demand better of our country. But the biggest piece, and I think takeaway as we approach an election, is wanting to know, like, read through those 94 calls to action and pick out the ones that you think you want to see the most action taken on immediately. and ask people when they come to your doors, and ask them why, like what they're going to do and how they're going to champion this and how they're going to stand up for it and exist in solidarity, even if their party leader doesn't prioritize it.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you so much for being here, Senator Kim. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. You are leaders.
Oh, well, thank you. And to everybody else, let us know in the comments what thoughts you have for what Senator Kim and I can chat about next.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.